Welcome back to the Morning Show here on Arise News. For his own worldview of a number of developments in the country's economic space, not forgetting President Buhari's new set of ministers, we are now being joined by Professor Kingsley Moghalu, a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Professor Moghalu was the presidential candidate of the Young Progressives Party during the 2019 general election. Professor Moghalu, welcome to the Morning Show. Good morning.
Welcome.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruben.
Good to have you again on the Morning Show. Well, we spent the last 45 minutes on this program analyzing the president's cabinet list and the inauguration yesterday, from presidential retreat to the inauguration. Let's start this off by having your take on that list and what should be the agenda for the ministers, because it looks like there was an omission in that respect, beyond the president just telling them, this is what we expect, this is what we expect. What's your view?
Well, my view is that, and it's not just a view, it's a fact. Poverty is the overriding reality of the lives of Nigerians today in our country. And therefore, the economic problems that Nigeria is facing. Our economy is the biggest problem we're facing, and it generates several other problems, including security problems. So the question, and President Buhari, in inaugurating the ministers, did indicate his awareness of this problem. He talked a lot about poverty. He talked a lot about the people expecting the ministers to address their needs. But the question is whether, beyond that rhetorical understanding of the fact that people are hurting in this country, is the cabinet the type of cabinet that can actually address the economy as a problem in Nigeria today. That's where I have some issues. But I would say that it's a good thing that he has given the ministers also a minister's mandate. So that indicates a performance management approach this time around. And we would like to see how this works in practice. So I'll give the ministers 1 month or two, and I'll be able to assess whether or not they're up to the job.
So let's talk about those issues that you have, because it is said that nature abhors a vacuum, and so does apparently economies. There's been a lot of criticisms that the central bank governor was straddling both monetary and fiscal policies, and this kind of multitasking was a distraction for CBN. Hard on the heels of President Buhari's instruction or directive that the central bank should stop giving forex to people importing food items, you were quick to remind the general public of what the mandate of central bank actually is, including its independence. So in view of all of this, can this cabinet actually pick up the slack?
Well, the cabinet is not constructed to address Nigeria's fundamental problem, in my view. The cabinet looks a very political cabinet. There's a lot of governors, former governors, senators. It seems more of a reward list than a cabinet formed with any realization that the economy is our #1 problem in this country. So, even there is a tension in forming any cabinet in Nigeria, realistically speaking, for a president. The president will have to look at the politics, that's normal, but I think there should be a balance between politics and policy. The composition of this cabinet doesn't even begin to pretend to balance politics and policy. It's a political cabinet. So the question is, what's the competence of these politicians in the area of the economy? So far, the track record has not been very good because the government has not yet identified the real issue with the economy, which is that Nigeria has no real economic philosophy. And therefore, the balance between the government and the private sector is skewed totally in favor of the government. And you see, Nigeria is not, if you want to run a state-driven economy, you better have a competent state. Nigeria doesn't have a competent state. We don't have a competent public service. And we don't have the fiscal revenues to run a government-driven economy. So there's a lot of room for the private sector to come in, but an enabling environment has not been created by this government. And one of the examples of that absence of an enabling environment is the fact that the central bank is, in my view, and the view of many people, being misused. They seem to be the Hercules. They seem to be the Sisyphus. You know, Hercules with 11 labors. Sisyphus rolling up the big Mount Boulder up the hill, but never being able to cross to the other side. Yes, so that's what's going on. And the central bank is overburdened, and I believe that it will not, in and of itself, be able to save the Nigerian economy.
So given this point of view that you have, what is your take on the president's demand to the central bank, rather, or it was seen as a demand, for the banning of Forex for food importation? How did you take this particular matter? And given that as well, now with the new Ministry of Agriculture, or the new Minister of Agriculture as well, what exactly do we need to be expecting from this very, very big, or as they like to call it, juicy ministry over the next couple of years?
Well, first of all, the president's quote-unquote directive to the central bank was wrong on two fronts. First of all, it undermines the independence of the central bank, which I established, that Article 1, subsection 3 of the Central Bank Act of 2007 makes it very clear that the bank is to be independent in the performance of its mandate. So directives from the president to the bank get in the way of the bank using a rational economic approach. What happens when you direct the bank is that you're expecting the bank to obey a political instruction, whether or not it is economically rational. So, and this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of poverty in Nigeria today. The people are suffering because institutions are not independent to do their work as they are mandated to do. The political class keeps interfering and using institutions to achieve short-term political ends. The reason the principle of central bank independence exists is precisely to avoid this problem, where you have transient political leaders giving instructions to central banks that will create long-term negative hardship for people in the economy. The second problem with the instruction that President Buhari gave to the central bank is that, looking at it economically, the central bank is using foreign exchange policy to run trade policy through the back door. That's what's happening in this country, and I think it's wrong. There is a big gap between the consumption of milk and other food items, you know, and the production locally. So why would you say that we would not give Forex? Why would you restrict Forex importation for fundamental food items when the production is not enough to meet the demand, but you can give foreign exchange for religious pilgrimages? This shows a wrong set of priorities in this country. Why would you subsidize religious pilgrimages with central bank Forex, but you can deny Forex for the importation of food items when the production locally is not up to what is needed? You should have done this in stages. I agree that we should be able to be food sufficient, but the problem we have is not Forex allocation or not. The problem we have is that our agriculture is not productive. And what is going to make agriculture productive? It is not making the central bank the Ministry of Agriculture. It is going to address the problems of productivity. High-yield seedlings need to be imported. People need to be educated. Mechanized farming is very important. So these are the things that will create better productivity in agriculture. It is not the issue of Forex or not. We need to become competitive in our agricultural production and our domestic manufacturing. We have had, I want to remind you, that we have had a lot of these policies for the last 4 years, specifically, talking about this administration, and for many years even before. But what is the result? Nigeria is the poverty capital of the world. We have an unemployment rate of 23%. You know, so people are very poor in this country. We should measure our policies with the reality on the ground in the lives of the average Nigerian citizens. The results don't show that these policies are working. It's not about propaganda. It's not about religious faith. Faith is the evidence of things hoped for, you know, the substance of things not yet seen. No, we don't run an economy like that. We don't run an economy. We run an economy based on rational data. What's the GDP of Nigeria? What's the GDP per capita? What's the GDP growth? These are the issues.
Mr. Moghalu, we need to take a commercial break, and then we'll come back to you. But while we're doing that, I would like to ask you to comment on the team that has shown up on the fiscal side. You have as Minister of Budget, Finance and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, holding 3 major portfolios. Do you think that's a good idea? And what do you think of the appointment of Otunba Adebayo as the Minister in charge of Industry, Trade and Investment? Do you consider that a strong team to address the fiscal side? But we'll take a break. When we return, you can address that question. Thank you. You're still watching The Morning Show here on our Rice News channel. And still with us in our Abuja studio is Professor Kingsley Moghalu, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria and presidential candidate of the Young Progressives Party during the 2019 general election in Nigeria. Professor Moghalu, we're back to you. And I'd asked you a question before we went on break about the merger of budget, finance, and national planning, and the appointment of Zainab Ahmed as the minister in charge, and also Otunba Adebayo as the minister in charge of industry, trade, and investment. What's your assessment? Do you think we have the right skill set here to address a fiscal crisis that has been identified?
Well, first of all, I don't really want to comment on individuals. I prefer to comment on government policy and the approach of the government. I find the merger of national planning and finance in this new cabinet very, very curious. And I would like to be more informed as a citizen about the rationale behind it. Maybe there's something we don't know, but I know that in the history of Nigeria, those 2 ministries have tended to be independent. And I think there is a very good reason for it, because national planning is actually supposed to be the driver of, you know, economic planning and, you know, management, whereas finance is more operational. If you merge the two, the independence of thinking that should go into national planning may be a bit lost in the operational dominance of the finance ministry. That's what I think. So I am not very sure it's a very good idea, but we will have to test it and then we will see. Certainly, the results of our economic management over the last 4 years leave a lot to be desired. There's no question about that. And that's not speaking, it's not judging an individual or not. It's judging the result of our political leadership. I want to always focus on the competence or the capacity of the highest level of political leadership. That's what determines whether or not you can have an economy that is doing very well. Now, on the question of Otunba Adebayo, I know Otunba Adebayo. He's a governor, a former governor of Ekiti State, and I think he performed quite okay. And I don't see that there is a problem with his being the Minister of Trade and Industry. But, like I said, overall, there's a problem with this cabinet. It is a very political cabinet. Investors were expecting some injection of strong technocrats alongside politicians. They don't see it. And so I am not sure how confident investors will still be or will be regarding the economy as it is presently constituted. Of course, we know that there were 15 women in the previous cabinet, now there are 7. There is almost no youth in this cabinet. So this cabinet seems that it's like it's facing the past, not the future. And then I note that President Buhari has reappointed himself as Petroleum Minister. Well, he made a big mistake. President Buhari should have reappointed or appointed himself as the Minister of Science and Technology, not the Minister of Petroleum, because that's where the emphasis should be going. But he continues this focus on petroleum and extractive minerals, which has taken us nowhere.
So that reminds me, as did your comments before the break about religious pilgrimage, of your piece in the Guardian of London about why African countries have fallen behind. And why is that? Can you tell us?
Absolutely.
Can we go over it again? Because what we're seeing now is that there's a lot of sentiment, a lot of superstition that goes into our decisions as a society and even as a government forming a cabinet. Everything but the logic of round pegs in round holes.
Yes. Now, the reason Africa is poor is because Africa is not productive, and Nigeria specifically, as supposedly the biggest economy in Africa, we worship the gods of small things. And one of the biggest small gods we worship, yes, one of the biggest small gods we worship is the god of oil. If you look at what is called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, how complex are different products occurring in nature in terms of what you can do with those products by turning them into value-added goods. There's a list of almost 2,000 items. Oil is near the bottom. Many people don't recognize this. Then we export crude natural resources and then import refined products. That's why we're poor. So the only thing that can save Nigeria is skills, human capital, that will enable it to drive innovation, new things constantly being invented and manufactured at scale to serve the needs of ordinary citizens. That's the reason we are poor. We are not focusing on innovation. We are not focusing on science. We pay lip service to it, and our ambitions are very low. When a minister says that we'll be producing pencils in 2 years, I am just amused, you know. But we know that the future will be controlled by Google and Alphabet. The future will be controlled by artificial intelligence. And we're not focusing on these things. How many I have? Yes, just last week, I spoke at Onisha. At least 3 young people brought me their business proposals, you know, who can fund them to mass produce things that they have invented. How can they produce a prototype that can be mass produced? So this is where our effort should be going into. And we need to create an economy out of these inventions so that we can meet our needs. It's not about Forex. I'm restricting Forex. But what are you generating internally that is competitive and can be exported to the rest of the world? So we have the wrong emphasis. And you see the president controlling the petroleum ministry. The age of petroleum is going. In 10 years, most of the countries in the Western world will not be using hydrocarbon fuels for their transportation. They'll be using electricity, they'll be using hydrogen, they'll be using solar power, and we are still focused on the past. And, you know, we're going to get left behind if we're not very careful. That's why I said the president should have appointed himself the Minister of Science and Technology and Ogbonnaya, the Minister of State, to show the right political emphasis about where the future of this country should be going. We have a lot of young people in this country, about 70% of our population. They are not represented in the cabinet. How do the things that concern them, and many of them are innovators, how do we think that these things are going to be addressed and the economy made better for our 200 million people? So I have my concerns about, the usual kinds of, politics I see in the composition of the cabinet. I don't think it's something that is going to liberate us, but like I said, let's see how they perform within the next month or 2. They may surprise us, and I'll be happy to be surprised.
Thank you very much for that point, Professor Moghalu, because I think the emphasis on oil is something that's even beyond just the cabinet that we're looking at now. Something that's also topical at the moment is the defense that Fowler gave, the chairman of the FIRS, when he was questioned about why the revenue generation had dropped in terms of tax. And he said it's because of a fall in oil prices that led to less income being generated, or less revenue, being generated. So I want to ask you a question as well as an economist. What do you think about this defense that Fowler gave? Do you think this defense was strong enough, or do you just think this is another case of what we're looking at, whereby we're just focusing on the completely wrong issues and we're not really actually providing any solution?
Well, of course, the defense is this, that the small god we worship has not been very healthy for for some time. That's what that defense is. And it goes to the point I'm making. For as long as this country continues to rely on petroleum revenues as its major source of fiscal revenue, for so long we are going to be beating around the bush. What we need to be doing is to really reform our taxation system. We need to massively expand the base of the numbers of millions of people who pay tax in this country. We need to bring in people from the informal economy, which is 65% of Nigeria's GDP. But we know that most of them do not pay tax. So I have always proposed, for the past 2 or 3 years, I have a proposal. Let us follow the mobile phone ownership track in this country, and we will find every citizen and do a tax audit, whether they're working, whether they're trading, and if so, what are you contributing to the tax net in Nigeria? I'm not advocating that we raise taxes. I'm advocating that more people need to pay tax instead of worshiping the god of oil. And we need to be productive, using innovation to export what we now manufacture with value added in Nigeria. That will bring in forex into this country, and you don't need central bank, controlling the foreign exchange or all these, forex restriction economics, which has not worked. Quite frankly, it hasn't worked. So the evidence is very clear. We can, preach to ourselves as if it's a church or a mosque and look at the economy or approach it from a religious faith basis. No. The rational evidence is that poverty is still very high in this country. Inflation is still reasonably high. GDP per capita is low. So these are the issues. And the only way we can break this cycle is to move away from oil thinking. We need to move to innovation. We need to move to skills. And we need to move to producing value-added things. We need fiscal reforms. We need to abolish the petroleum subsidy, but the political will is obviously not there. But we spend trillions of naira every year subsidizing petroleum instead of investing in our security, investing in the police, investing in schools, investing in hospitals. So we're doing the wrong things.
Well, quickly, Kingsley, you were Deputy Governor, Central Bank, in charge of financial stability. And recently, there have been 2 major developments with regard to monetary policy. First, the 5-year plan that was unveiled by the governor of the central bank, Emefiele, in which he emphasized financial stability, financial inclusion, diversification, and also something about the recapitalization of the banks, to which he didn't put a figure. What's your assessment of that 5-year plan? And then the Monetary Policy Committee, at its last meeting, decided to leave all the ratios unchanged: cash reserve ratio, liquidity ratio, and also the monetary policy rate. Do you think that was a good decision?
Well, the monetary policy of the central bank is largely reactive because of the failure of fiscal policy in Nigeria. This is what we have seen. Even when we had a very brilliant, and world-renowned Minister of Finance in the person of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, there were a lot of political factors, even though she achieved a lot, but there were a lot of political factors that still circumscribed, how much could be done in the fiscal space. I know, for example, that she planned a, gradual reduction in how much of our budget is spent on recurrent expenditure. But at the end of the day, we have not seen a decrease after that government has left office. And that's because the politics of rents and rent seeking is what is driving the economy. So the central bank, in some of its monetary policy decisions, is reacting to those issues. Now, we need to address, that's why I keep talking about the structural reforms that are necessary. Those structural problems, infrastructure, makes the cost of money expensive. The recurrent expenditure that is dominating the spending of the federal government creates inflation. And when there is inflation, the central bank must respond by tightening the money supply. That's why I say that the central bank cannot save Nigeria's economy. despite the fact that this government seems to believe that the central bank is the beginning and end of economic management. That's a wrong approach because the structural foundations have not been fixed. So the central bank will keep reacting.
Thank you very much, Professor Kingsley Moghalu. That's all we'll be able to take in this segment of the program. But we've enjoyed our conversation with you very much. We've been, educated, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you very much,
Thank you
Professor.
very much.